There's this fundamental truth in geoscience education. Nothing really beats getting out there.
Boots on the ground?
Yeah, boots on the ground, hammer in hand, safely, of course, seeing the scale, touching the rocks, understanding the landscape firsthand, field experiences. They're cornerstone, aren't they?
Yeah.
Offering these invaluable opportunities.
They absolutely are. It's the tradition. It's core to how so many geoscientists are trained. But let's be honest, traditional fieldwork, it comes with some pretty significant challenges.
Right.
I mean, think about the logistics alone. Getting a whole class to some remote spot.
Huge undertaking.
And the cost. For the institution, sure, but also for the students themselves, then there are potential safety hazards, and maybe the biggest one, the huge accessibility hurdles for a lot of students.
Yeah, physical ability, time, family stuff, just living far away. Those barriers are massive.
They really are.
And this is precisely where technology kind of steps in, right? We're talking about virtual field experiences, VFEs.
Exactly, VFEs and, advancements in digital media. Plus, let's face it, the pandemic really pushing things along.
Oh, definitely accelerated.
It's really spurred the exploration of VFEs as, well, potential tools, alternatives, maybe supplements.
So the core question that this new review article tackles is, how effective are these VFEs, really? And maybe more importantly, when you put them side by side with traditional in-person field experiences, IPFEs, how do they actually compare?
Yeah, that's the crux of it. This source material, it's a really thorough review. It looks at a whole bunch of recent studies and tries to pull out what's genuinely meaningful and actionable for understanding VFEs.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack this review. We want to get a handle on what VFEs even are, how they're classified, then look at the evidence. How effective are they just on their own? And then get into that comparison with the gold standard in-person trip.
And ultimately, the goal here for you listening is to understand how this research might inform ways to provide more equitable access to field-based learning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For those students facing those real barriers we talked about, VFEs could be a pathway, a way into experiences they might otherwise completely miss out on. So let's dive in. What did the review find?
Okay, so first things first, what is a VFE? The review uses a pretty broad definition, basically using any kind of digital media to reproduce the experience of, visiting a physical place.
Right. And it's way beyond just looking at static photos now, isn't it? The tech has just exploded.
Oh, completely. The review traces that evolution from, early uses of just conventional images, standard video, to today's stuff, interactive 360-degree media, these incredible high-res gigapan images, dynamic 3D models you can spin around, map-based tools like ArcGIS Story Maps, Google Earth. The toolkit is huge now.
And people access them differently, too, like browser versus headset.
Yeah, that's right. Some are web-based. You just need a browser. Others might be installable apps. And then you have the fully immersive virtual reality headsets, HMDs, head-mounted displays.
Okay. But one challenge the source flags right away is terminology. It's a bit of a mess.
Oh, it is a bit, yeah. You see different researchers using different acronyms for pretty similar things. VFT, IVFT, VLE, VFE. It can make comparing findings across studies a little tricky sometimes.
I can imagine. So how does the review try to bring some order to that?
Well, it adopts a classification system from Klippel and colleagues. It's not, universally agreed upon yet, but it's a useful framework. It divides VFEs into 3 levels: basic, plus, and advanced.
Okay, walk us through those. Basic.
Basic is pretty much what it sounds like. It's essentially a virtual copy of an IPFE. It simulates what you could see and maybe do in person. Think visual observation mainly, like navigating through 360 photos or videos.
Got it. Just showing you what's there.
Pretty much. Then the plus level adds features you couldn't normally do or see in person.
Ah, the superpowers.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
Like getting an instant bird's eye view, or maybe comparing 2 different outcrops side by side on the screen, or teleporting between locations, things beyond normal physical ability.
Okay, makes sense. And advanced.
Advanced VFEs are really interactive. You can actively interrogate the virtual environment, maybe take virtual measurements, click on an outcrop to get data, maybe even run simulations of geological processes, watch erosion happen over virtual millennia, that kind of thing.
So doing things you literally can't do in the real field. This classification seems helpful, but it also points to trade-offs, right? Like VR headset immersion versus just using a web browser.
Absolutely. There's always a trade-off. High immersion often means higher cost, more complexity, maybe less scalability than something simple and web-based. Different tools for different jobs, really.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting for me. How effective are these things? When we just look at VFEs on their own, do they actually teach geoscience well?
Right. So the review looked at studies assessing effectiveness. And they usually look at two main things: cognitive outcomes, so knowledge gain, skills learned.
Like, did they learn the geology?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And effective outcomes, things like attitudes, engagement, sense of presence, connection to nature, often using pre- and post-tests or surveys.
And the review highlighted some specific studies here.
It did. Let's start with Markovits and colleagues from 2018. They focused on climate change, specifically ocean acidification.
Okay. And they looked at different groups, not just students.
Yeah, it was pretty broad. High school students, undergrads and grads, even the general public at a science festival using a VR arcade setup.
Wow. And what kind of VFE did they use?
It was an immersive VR one, so using headsets, probably a plus level VFE. Students could embody either a piece of coral or a scuba diver exploring a reef affected by acidification.
Interesting. So what were the key takeaways from those Markovits studies?
Pretty consistently, they found significant knowledge gains about ocean acidification across the different groups, but also, importantly, they saw positive impacts on environmental attitudes and people's self-reported connection to nature.
That's really significant. It's not just facts, it's affecting how they feel.
Exactly. That affective component is key.
Were there any, surprising details in their findings?
Yeah, a couple of things stood out. First, it didn't seem to matter much whether you were the virtual coral or the virtual scuba diver. Your avatar didn't really change the outcome.
Huh. Okay.
But, and this is cool, the sense of presence reported by participants, how much they felt like they were really there in that virtual reef.
Yeah.
That strongly correlated with both the knowledge gains and the positive shifts in attitude.
Whoa. So feeling immersed, feeling present actually helped them learn more and care more.
That's what the data suggested, yeah. The other interesting bit was that physical movement within the VFE, like literally looking around, virtually swimming.
Actively exploring.
Right. That, and just the sheer amount they observed or traveled virtually, seemed to predict both knowledge gain and how curious they were afterwards.
Okay, so that gives designers some concrete pointers, doesn't it? Like boost the audio visuals for presence, include simple ways to interact and move.
Definitely. Enhance the realism, give people things to do. Though it's worth noting, these studies didn't compare the VR setup to, say, a desktop VFE doing the same thing.
Right, which actually brings us nicely to the work by Mead and colleagues in 2019 and 2022. They focus specifically on browser-based VFEs, right? The more accessible kind.
Exactly. Designed for regular computers, their VFEs used interactive 360-degree images, kind of like Google Street View, but for geology sites. You could click on things.
Annotations.
Yeah, clickable annotations that brought up more info images, videos, zoomable close-ups. They also structured them as lessons and, crucially, included adaptive feedback.
Adaptive feedback. What does that mean in this context?
It means the VFE responded based on the student's answers. Get something right, move on. Get it wrong, maybe get a hint or be directed back to look at something specific in the virtual environment.
Smart. And did their design evolve over time?
It did. Their later work moved away from just multiple choice buttons. They had students clicking directly on geological features in the 360 images. A bit less linear, more exploratory. They also played with gamification points, challenges, nonlinear paths.
Okay, sounds engaging. What about the results? Did these browser-based VFEs lead to learning?
Yes, significantly so. They found statistically significant and actually large learning gains measured immediately after the VFE lesson. This was true for both high school and university students.
Large gains.
And the 2019 study with high schoolers also looked at retention. They found that a good chunk of those gains were still there 10 weeks later. That suggests it wasn't just superficial learning.
That's pretty robust.
Yeah.
Shows you don't necessarily need the fancy VR headset for significant learning if the instructional design is solid.
Precisely. Good pedagogy matters, whatever the platform.
Huh.
These studies, again, weren't comparative to other VFE types, but they really detailed the design elements that worked in their browser setup.
Okay. Then there's Watson et al., looking at volcanology for majors.
Right. Also browser-based. This one included videos, 360 videos, 3D models of volcanic areas in Iceland. And their assessment method was pretty clever.
Oh, so?
They used a pre-post concept sketching task. Students had to draw and interpret a lava flow that wasn't actually shown in the VFE. So it was testing if they could transfer the skills learned in the VFE to a new problem.
Ah, testing transfer. That's a higher bar. What did they find?
Well, they found nominal content learning gains, maybe not as large as Mead's studies, but the biggest improvement was in the students' ability to interpret the geology from different perspectives in their sketches.
So the VFE helped with spatial reasoning and interpretation skills.
That's what it looks like. And students actually reported that seeing the different views, the 360s, the 3D models in the VFE, directly helped them develop those interpretation skills.
The review mentioned a possible reason why the straight content gains might have seemed a bit lower here.
Yeah, it's important context. The students in this study were geology majors. They'd already had quite a bit of background on volcanology from lectures before they even did the VFE.
Ah, so there might have been a ceiling effect. They already knew a lot of the basic content.
Potentially, yeah. The VFE might have been reinforcing and deepening understanding, especially interpretive skills, rather than introducing brand new concepts to novices.
Okay. Now, Bond et al. Gives us a different angle, looking at the experience during the pandemic, right? When a capstone field course went virtual.
Exactly. This was a browser-based VFE replacing a big multi-week in-person capstone trip. They didn't just measure learning gains, they surveyed students and staff about the hindrances and affordances. Basically, what worked well and what didn't work so well about the virtual experience.
So what were the positives? The affordances?
Accessibility and inclusion came up again really strongly. Students and staff highlighted that. They also liked having good online access to instructors, being able to visit loads of sites at different scales really quickly.
Things you can't easily do physically.
Right. Working at their own pace was a plus, and building digital skills. And interestingly, something simple. Having a printed workbook to use alongside the digital VFE was seen as really valuable.
That's a good practical tip. What about the downsides, the hindrances?
Well, the big one was the lack of social interaction and team building. Students really missed that. Home distractions were a problem for some.
Understandable.
And obviously, you can't learn certain hands-on field skills, taking measurements, navigating tricky terrain, real-world safety procedures. Some felt the duration was off, and then you had the inevitable tech glitches, hardware, software, internet issues.
It's interesting, though, that instructors noted something counterintuitive. Less time spent on logistics for the physical trip.
Yeah.
Actually freed them up for more direct teaching interaction with students online.
That's a really key point, isn't it? How time gets reallocated. So based on all that feedback, their recommendations were pretty practical. Provide hard copies, record sessions, have tech support ready, and importantly, consciously design opportunities for students to interact with each other.
Makes sense. Okay, one more in this non-comparative section. Dolphin et al. They actually watched students using VFEs.
Yeah, this was observational. They looked at introductory students working in groups using immersive Google Earth VFEs for open inquiry tasks. Less about measuring gains, more about how students approached the learning.
And what did they see? What were the challenges?
They found students really struggled with the open-ended nature of it, like figuring out what data to pull from these big, complex Google Earth views.
Information overload.
Maybe, yeah. And connecting what they were seeing virtually to actual geological interpretations. That leap was hard. They also noticed many students didn't use all the features, like zooming way in. And yeah, they missed the sensory stuff, touching rocks, feeling the scale.
But the insight here wasn't just VFEs are hard.
No, that was the important part. The researchers realized these struggles, observation, extracting data, making inferences, weren't just VFE problems. They reflect broader challenges students often have in geoscience, period, whether it's virtual or physical.
So the VFE revealed existing learning challenges.
Exactly, which actually led them to redesign things, adding more pre-VFE prep work and even bringing in physical rock samples to use alongside the virtual exploration.
Okay, so that's a good overview of VFEs on their own terms. They can lead to learning, they have accessibility benefits, but let's get to the big comparison. Can VFEs actually replace the real thing, the IPSE? What does the review say?
Well, the review is pretty direct about it. It states, and I'm quoting loosely here, that it is unlikely that VFEs could plausibly seek to replace the complete experiences of IPFEs, at least right now.
Okay. And the reasons seem pretty clear from what we've discussed already.
Yeah, I mean, they just can't replicate everything. All the sensory input, the feel of the wind, the smell of the rain on rock, the actual texture.
The physical effort of hiking the outcrop.
Exactly, that embodied learning moving through a complex space. Or the potential for completely spontaneous discovery when you just wander off path a bit. And just technically capturing huge, intricate field sites perfectly virtually is still really, really hard.
But the whole reason we're even having this conversation, why VFEs are being explored so much,
is precisely because they do tackle those massive barriers of traditional fieldwork. Inaccessibility, cost, safety, remoteness, they minimize or eliminate those problems.
I'm right. And we have to acknowledge, as the review does, there's pushback in the community.
Oh, absolutely. Geoscience education has traditionally been built around fieldwork. Many educators were trained that way. They value it deeply for good reason. So there's understandable skepticism about how effective a virtual substitute can really be.
But the comparative studies give us actual data to look at, not just tradition.
Exactly. Empirical evidence. So let's dive into those. Stump et al. Back in 2008, did an early comparison, simple web page VFE versus an IPFE, and a group that did both in an intro physical geography course.
Okay, what did they measure?
Standard pre-post tests for content knowledge, and they had students write an essay to gauge effect, like appreciation for the place.
Now finding.
It was pretty significant, especially for back then. No significant difference in content knowledge gains between the three groups. VFE only, IPFE only, or the combo group, they all learned the content about equally well.
Wow, even that early on. No difference for intro students on content.
Right. Where they did see a difference was in those essays. The students who went on the actual field trip, the IPFE group, reported a greater personal appreciation for the place. They felt it had a bigger impact on how they thought about that environment.
So content learning was equal, but the effective impact, the feeling, was stronger in person.
That's what the study found, yeah. Their conclusion was basically, VFE is just as good for content, better for accessibility, but maybe be cautious extending this to advanced courses, and they worried a bit about losing the social recruitment aspect of field trips.
Okay, fast forward a decade or so. Clip et al., 2019. They compared an immersive, headset-based basic VFE to a closely matched IPFE for studying an outcrop in an intro course.
Yeah, and this one had a really striking result. They looked at assignment grades for content, plus surveys on enjoyment and learning perception.
And
the VFE group, the ones using the VR headsets, reported significantly higher enjoyment, felt they learned better, and they got significantly higher grades on the assignment than the students who went to the actual outcrop.
Wait, higher grades with a virtual trip? That seems counterintuitive to the traditional view.
It does. It was a surprising finding. The researchers offered a possible explanation. Maybe the overall experience was just better in the VFE in this specific case. Perhaps the weather was bad at the real site, or it was hard to get to, making the controlled, comfortable VFE comparatively more effective and pleasant.
So context matters, the quality of the IPFE experience itself.
Potentially, yeah. They also wondered if the immersive nature of the HMDs amplified the benefits, though they couldn't prove that directly from their study design.
Interesting. Okay, Zhao et al.
Yeah.
In 2020, also compared different formats for intro students. IPFE versus an immersive VFE with headsets, IVFE, versus a standard desktop VFE, all basic level.
Right. Now, this study relied mostly on student self-report surveys, attitudes, usability, sense of presence, perceived learning experience, perceived outcomes. They couldn't use assignment scores directly.
Okay, so based on student perceptions, what do they find?
Well, first, comparing the two virtual types. No significant difference between the immersive headset VFE and the desktop VFE on most measures. Perceived learning, usability outcomes, pretty similar.
But the headset one caused more queasiness.
Yeah, the IBFE group reported significantly more simulator sickness, which, isn't ideal for learning.
Definitely not.
No.
So the desktop versions seemed just as good perceptually, but more comfortable and cheaper.
That's sort of the implication from their perception data, yeah. And here's the other kicker. The group that went on the actual field trip, the IPFE group, reported significantly lower perceptions of their learning experience and outcomes compared to both of the VFE groups.
Lower than both virtual groups. Again, challenging the assumption that in-person is always perceived as better for learning by intro students.
Exactly. It provides more evidence, at least based on perception, that VFEs can be comparatively effective, sometimes maybe even perceived as more effective, in certain introductory contexts.
Okay, let's look at Roberto et al. From 2023. This sounds like a cool one. A virtual raft trip via E versus a real walk for Grand Canyon geology.
Yeah, it was a plus-level VFE, browser-based, simulating a raft trip focusing on the Great Unconformity. Compared against an IPFE, which was a walk along the Trail of Time at the Grand Canyon South Rim, they had both intro and advanced students.
And they used concept sketching for assessment again.
They did. Graded with a rubric to measure content learning gains. And their main finding was pretty clear. Significantly greater learning gains were achieved with the VFE alone.
Greater gains with the virtual raft trip, even for the advanced students.
For the specific content measured by the concept sketch, yes. The effective side was a bit more nuanced. The IPFE group actually reported higher positive feelings before the trip started.
Maybe the allure of the Grand Canyon itself.
Possibly, yeah. Pre-existing excitement. But the VFE students mentioned feeling that the embedded videos in the virtual trip offered a greater sense of personal attention from the instructor. And here's a fascinating twist. Doing the VFE actually increased students' interest in taking a real Grand Canyon field trip later on.
Whoa. So it wasn't a replacement. It was like an appetizer. It made them want the real thing more.
That's exactly the implication. It reframes the whole thing. Their conclusion was basically, yes, well-designed VFEs can absolutely produce cognitive gains, sometimes even exceeding IPFEs for specific content. But maybe their best role is as a complement, not as a plant. Use them beforehand, maybe, to reduce anxiety or build foundational knowledge, what they called reducing the novelty space.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, finally, the pandemic forced some large-scale, real-world tests, especially for those capstone courses that are usually all about fieldwork. Whitmire et al. And Guillaume et al. Looked at these.
Right. Whitmire compared a Google Earth-based plus VFE that replaced a capstone trip against historical data from previous in-person versions. They surveyed students about their experiences.
What did the students think? Mixed feelings.
Very mixed, yeah. Initial concerns, but many gained appreciation for the VFE. There was disappointment about missing the traditional trip. Some found the VFE less satisfying emotionally. But they really valued being able to revisit sites, review content whenever they wanted, and having clearer views without, bushes or bad weather in the way.
And the accessibility point came up again.
Big time. Students with disabilities really benefited. Overall, the preference was still mostly for the IPFE, but about 20% actually preferred the VFE, and a lot saw a hybrid model as the ideal solution going forward.
And what about the instructors in that study? What were their takeaways?
Strengths they saw were flexibility in design, easily revisiting sites, adding extra data layers or animations seamlessly, and definitely the greater accessibility. Weaknesses were clear, too. Losing the embodied learning, not being able to teach hands-on measurement or safety skills effectively, a diminished sense of place, and maybe less student enthusiasm.
So their plan was?
To go back to IPFEs when possible, but to integrate VFEs, strategically use them for sites that are inaccessible, or maybe as pre-trip preparation or post-trip review. Hybridize.
Okay. And Guillaume also looked at pandemic capstone VFEs for majors, some using avatars.
Yeah, plus level VFEs on Google Earth or custom platforms. Some had students represented by avatars they could move around.
Did the avatars behave like students in the field?
Interestingly, yes. The researchers observed avatar behaviors, grouping up, pointing things out. Even some recreational behavior were quite similar to what you see on a real field trip.
Huh, okay. And student response?
Generally positive. They felt the VFE learning experience adequately replicated many aspects of the IPFE, except for the richness of social interactions. That was the big gap. They valued IPFEs, but also strongly pointed out how exclusionary they can be due to accessibility issues.
So again, that inclusivity benefit shines through.
Absolutely. Their conclusion framed VFEs as legitimate supplements, especially for improving inclusivity. They did express some caution, maybe contrary to other studies, about whether VFEs could fully meet introductory learning outcomes, but also warned against confusing VFE limitations with general online learning challenges like bad internet or hardware problems.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Let's try to synthesize this.
Yeah.
Pulling all these findings together from the review, what's the big picture message for you listening?
I think the science is increasingly suggesting that VFEs are a valuable, effective approach, particularly for teaching introductory geoscience content. We saw several comparative studies showing they can sometimes even equal or exceed the effectiveness of IPFEs for certain learning goals in that intro context.
And the advantages are pretty clear and consistent across the studies.
Yeah, undeniably. The biggest one is improving inclusivity and accessibility, opening doors for students who just cannot do traditional field work because of cost, disability, time, family, whatever the barrier. That's huge.
Plus visiting places you otherwise couldn't.
Right. Remote places, hazardous sites, places that are just logistically impossible, and they can really enhance existing trips, pre-trip prep, post-trip review, filling gaps. They augment and complement nicely.
It does sound like the evidence is maybe a bit stronger for the intro level compared to advanced professional training right now.
That seems fair based on this review, yeah.
Hmm.
IPFEs are still seen as dominant for that advanced professional prep, even though a pandemic showed VFEs could be, let's say, minimally functional replacements when absolutely necessary.
And the review pointed out a gap in the research here.
Definitely. A lot of the comparative work so far has relied heavily on subjective measures, student perceptions, feelings, self-reported learning, which is valuable, but we need more studies using objective, measurable cognitive outcomes, especially when we're talking about advanced skills or training.
And we still have that underlying tension, right?
Yeah.
The deep cultural value placed on fieldwork in geoscience.
For sure. There's resistance to anything perceived as diminishing the role of traditional fieldwork, and that's understandable given its history and importance. But the review kind of pushes back gently, suggesting that, as scientists, we should really look at the empirical data. Are there situations or concepts where VFEs might actually be more effective, even for advanced learning, rather than just sticking to tradition?
So it's probably not about VFE or IPFE, but VFE and IPFE, finding the best blend.
That seems to be the strong message coming out of this synthesis, yeah. They each have unique strengths. The review talks about the tremendous potential of courses that can seamlessly integrate both.
And the review points towards specific areas for future research based on this.
Oh yeah, several clear paths. We need formal studies on how best to create those hybrid VFE, IPFE formats. What's the optimal blend? How do we use virtual tools to make the in-person time even more valuable?
That's a great question.
And another one, what's the downstream effect? If students use more VFEs early on, does that actually make them more comfortable or successful when they hit those upper-level field courses or field camp later? Does it build confidence and foundational skills?
Could virtual prep enhance real-world performance? That's fascinating.
It really is. And finally, the social aspect. It's often cited as a VFE weakness, but VFEs can be done collaboratively. So more research is needed on social learning within VFEs. How effective is it? How do those group dynamics compare to being out in the field together?
Lots to explore still. So bringing this deep dive to a close, the key takeaway seems to be virtual field experiences are evolving fast. They're a powerful tool. Research increasingly shows their value, especially for accessibility in intro geoeducation, and sometimes even for boosting learning gains on specific topics.
Right, but they don't yet fully replicate that rich, complex, multisensory, embodied experience of actually being there in person.
And understanding their strengths, particularly in opening doors for students facing barriers, seems absolutely crucial. And for you listening, think about how this research into learning tech, into accessibility, into how we design instruction, might connect beyond just geology. Maybe it makes you think about your own learning, virtual or in person, or how you might teach or train others.
Yeah, and maybe a final thought to leave you with, based on the source. Given that we're seeing well-designed virtual experiences can lead to significant learning and open up participation, how might we get really creative in combining the unique strengths of both virtual and in-person experiences? How could that combination actually redefine and broaden what field learning even means in the future?
Something to definitely ponder. Thanks for unpacking that with us.
My pleasure.